from that period, they are really quoting much older statements which had been handed down as part of the oral tradition, and then eventually become recorded by a class, a historical period known as the Tanaim, and the later class known as the Amoraim. More on that in a few lectures. So the texts that we're describing today, many of them can be dated with accuracy no earlier than, say, about the year 100 before the Common Era, but they are quoting much earlier traditions. And we see this, by the way, in other groups as well. Homer, for example, the Odyssey and the Iliad, the great classics of Greek early literature, were also handed down as oral traditions until they were finally recorded in text. Now, the term midrash is a way of approaching the text of the Torah, of interpreting the text of the Torah. It comes from the word drash, which means to seek out, to request, or to examine. And it is a fascinating and often quite disruptive means of understanding the meaning of the Torah text itself. It's really quite creative. In many ways, it's not dissimilar from a lot of modern literary techniques, such as deconstructionism and so on. Fascinating ways of reading the text, often reading it with multiple valences in, contradictory directions. Absolutely fascinating. I should point out, and it's very important to understand, that according to Jewish theology, midrash also comes from Sinai, that it is an oral tradition that goes all the way back to the roots of the written text itself, and as such has tremendous importance. However, when you have midrashim that move in different directions, or midrashim that seem to be, highly hyperbolic in nature, it can be very difficult to understand what exactly they mean. Many approaches, particularly in the modern era, understand the midrash to be, very poetic in nature rather than hard and fast and meant to be taken on a literal level, but I will leave that to the rabbis to figure out. I'm just a regular historian, not a rabbinic authority. So there is halachic midrash and there is agadic midrash. Halachic is an adjective, an English form of an adjective, based on the word halacha, which means to walk or to travel. And this is the word used for Jewish law. We'll have much more to say about this as halacha is developed, and especially when it's codified in the medieval period. At any rate, halachic midrash are midrashic readings of the text by the rabbis that inform how Jews should behave, hence halachic. So, for example, you'll see on the left here is a photograph of an IDF soldier who is wearing phylacteries, or in Hebrew, tefillin. These are leather boxes that are commonly worn during weekday prayer. The box on the top contains several scriptural passages, and the box on the left arm also contains scriptural passages, and there is a ritual for wrapping them around the arm and so on, and then prayers are read while these are worn. Now, a question might arise, where does all this come from? Right? If you read the Bible itself, it says in Deuteronomy that you shall bind them, which appears to be a reference to the words of the Torah, as a sign upon your hands and as frontlets upon your eyes. Now, what exactly is a sign in your hand? What does that look like? And frontlets between your eyes, what does that mean also? So the Midrash steps in to give us some explanation. Let's have a quick look at one example. You'll note in the picture here that the box of tefillin on the arm is worn on the left arm, on the bicep, slightly tilted inwards towards the heart, and it's worn correctly. Let's have a look at how we get to that from the Midrash. So this is from the Midrash Halacha called Sifrei, which is written on the book of Devarim, or Deuteronomy, and I've taken these citations from the amazing website Sefaria, which is a fantastic place to get Hebrew text. It's huge and free and wide open. I love it. So here it is. I'll read in Hebrew. Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Al Yadcha, Begoba Shel Yad. The Torah says that you should wear the tefillin on your hand, and that means the high part of your hand. So what would that be? Well, you figure that's up towards the top. Maybe perhaps on the bulge of the bicep. But you said it should be on the high part of the hand, but maybe it should be on the hand itself. I mean, the text only says on your hand, Talmud Lomar, and it will be for you as a sign upon your hands, for you as a sign, and not as a sign for others, right? So you read what's happening here. The Midrash is kind of looking with a microscope at the text itself, and you're trying to figure out, well, where do you put this box? Do you put it on the back of your hand? Do you put it on your forearm? Where does it go? It says, well, the rest of the text says it shall be for you as a sign, something that's closer to you. So that would mean up here, which is close to the center of my body, myself, my heart, and so on. Okay, interesting. Like the Midrash is investigating and asking. It's not written like, a series of rules. It's written like a give and take. We'll have more to see about that in the Mishnah. These words shall be on your heart. It means that it should be something close to your heart. Where is closest to your heart on your hand? Well, that would clearly be your bicep, right? So here's an example of the Midrash really picking apart the text, finding a couple of words. One is for you, and another one is your heart. Those are one words each in Hebrew because they have prefixes and so on. So that's how you know where the tefillin should be worn. It doesn't exist in the text itself. You have to unpack the text to get to the meaning of it. Now let's just go a little further. And Midrash, by the way, goes deep and deep and further like you wouldn't believe. Davar acher, another interpretation. That itself is fascinating. The Midrash will allow multiple interpretations. Al yadcha zesmol. When it says on your hand, it means your left hand. Why? Ata omer zesmol o enel yamin. You say it's the left hand, maybe it's the right hand. Says, okay, I can't prove it to you for sure, but I can give you kind of an illusion. If you look in the book of Judges, it says, Yada liated shalchena v'yamina malos amalim. So then the Midrash goes on, I'll paraphrase in English, that in the reference there where Yael kills Sisera by driving a tent peg through his temple, yikes, her hand reaches out to the peg, and her right hand is holding the hammer. So there you go. Whenever it says hand on its own, without specifying right hand, must mean it's a left hand. Okay, nice. That's not a proof, but it's at least one example. In number 9, then Rabbi Natan says the same thing, that it combines binding with writing. So that means that the hand that you do the binding with is the same hand that you do writing with. And for most people, that is the right hand. And the Midrash will go on and on. I'm not going to do the last part here, but there's so much of it. What about if you're naturally left-handed? What about if a person is an amputee? All kinds of things like this the Midrash will explore. And of course, this is just the beginning of a long exploration, which you'll also find in the Talmud. So Midrash is such a clear example of how the rabbis now, as information workers, are teasing out the meaning of the text and providing direct, clear instruction on halakha, how to behave. The other major area of Midrash, and I would argue that especially since the Talmud, the Agadic Midrash is even more important. Unlike halakha, which deals primarily with what Jews should do, how they should act, Agada, on the other hand, which is related to the word Haggadah, like in the Passover Seder, means the telling, refers to how Jews might want to think, refers to lessons of the text, philosophy, history, biography, metaphysics, all kinds of things about the text that reveals to us that doesn't necessarily specifically mandate a particular course of action, but does mandate some kind of thought process. So just to give you one example, the binding of Isaac, which is described in Genesis 22. So in that passage, when God first approaches Abraham and says, I want you to sacrifice Isaac, the actual text of God's request is a little more specific. It says, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, even Isaac. Now the Midrash asks, why all this detail? Why not just say, take Isaac? What is this business of all these other phrases? So let's look at Bereshit Rabbah. Bereshit is the Hebrew word for Genesis, once again from the amazing Sefaria website. And the phrase says, V'yomer kachna es bincha, etc. Take your son, and so on. Amar lo, and by the way, you'll notice that in the printed text, they don't even bother quoting the rest of the verse, because you really should know it. What are you doing this, studying Midrash, if you haven't studied the Torah properly? You got to know your verses very well. Amar lo, b'vakasha mimcha kachna es bincha. So God says to him, please, take your son. Amar le, train benin isli. So Abraham says back to God, this is not in the biblical text. This is the Midrash interpolating a dialogue that is not reproduced in the biblical text. How to approach that interpolation? Is it imaginary? Is it a thought experiment? Is it actual? What exactly does it mean? And we're going to ask a rabbi. But God's, and note, by the way, if you're sensitive to language, that this is written in Aramaic rather than Hebrew, which indicates a sense of that it would have been written down in text form, even though it could have been repeated over in Hebrew much longer. Further back in history, it was recorded, certainly in the period when Jews spoke Aramaic more than they spoke Hebrew. Anyway, Abraham says to God, what do you mean? I've got two sons. Which son are you referring to? Right? Don't forget, Abraham has Yishmael, the older son, and Yitzchak, the younger son, Isaac. Amar lo, so God says to him, Es yechidcha, your only son. Right? Remember that the text in the Bible said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, even Isaac. So God says to Abraham, I mean your only son. So Abraham doesn't leave it alone. Amar lo, ze yachid le'imo. Ze yachid le'imo. God, I don't understand. This one, Yishmael, is the only son of his mother. And this one, Isaac, is also the only son of his mother. Yishmael is the only son of Hagar. Isaac is the only son of Sarah. Which one do you mean? Amar lo, asher ohavta. God says, okay, Abraham, the one that you love. Right, so listen to what Abraham says. He says, are there limits to emotions? Meaning, is it possible for me to measure which one I love more? You know, if there's a limit to this, I don't know. So and finally, God says to him, Amarlo es Yitzchak. He says to him, okay, Isaac, that's what I'm talking about. I'm going to keep talking, and meanwhile, I'm going to put the English up here so you can review my translation. But basically, what's going on in this Midrash is God is stretching out the conversation with Abraham, or perhaps we can say that Abraham is stretching out the conversation. The conclusion of the Midrash is that God stretches this out in order that every aspect of this commandment should be cherished, meaning it's a long, detailed description of what Abraham is supposed to do in order that Abraham should take it very seriously and perform it with great precision. Now, I would like to suggest as well that there are other readings of this Midrash as well, and that's one of the amazing things about Aggadic Midrash, is that it's so rich and powerfully deep in meaning that you can really think so many profound thoughts as you try to work through the Midrash. Also, note please that the Midrash seems to be intrinsically opaque. It's not transparent. It doesn't give it to you on a platter. Everything the Midrash is trying to say requires you to respond to it. Perhaps this is another way of understanding the word Midrash itself. It's a search. It's a journey for meaning. It's an attempt to discover something. And in that sense, Midrash is absolutely fascinating and beautiful to study. Okay, let us go on in the next lecture to talk about the Mishnah, another incredibly important achievement of this particular period of Jewish history. Let us now discuss the Mishnah. And as you can see from this photograph here, the Mishnah was, for the vast majority of Jewish history, the preserve exclusively of men. This is a highly androcentric activity. The yeshiva is, for most of Jewish history, a men's club where guys get together, typically in uniform like this, with black kippahs and white shirts, and they struggle to understand the meaning of the text. In the 20th century in particular, we see a lot of change. God willing, we'll speak about that change later on in this series, but for the time being, this is essentially a man's activity, but that's not where I'm going right now. Let's go to the text itself. One of the major things that happens towards the end of the period that we're discussing right now, right around the year 200 of the Common Era, is a fateful decision by Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, who is a Jew charged with the political leadership of the Jewish population in Israel. And remember, this is a good 130 years after the destruction of the temple, after tremendous devastation, persecution of the Jews, expansion of the diaspora, Jews taken into slavery, phenomenal economic pressures, all kinds of things are threatening to tear apart the Jewish people. And Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi decided to take a fairly dramatic step, which was heavily criticized in its time, of taking all this body of information, which we have called the Oral Torah, and recording it in writing. That is, taking something which has been for centuries handed down from rabbi to student, debated orally in study halls, such as the one I showed you earlier, and suddenly say, you know what, now we are going to capture it in specific words on a page. They're going to be reified, there's going to be a text, it's going to be like the written Torah, which has more or less been canonized since the first century at any rate, and now we're going to take this intentionally flexible document and body of teachings, and we are going to freeze it in stone, canonize it much like the Bible has been canonized, and that's going to change the way Jews learn their Torah forever. It's also after the disastrous Bar Kokhba rebellion that results in even more devastation, particularly in the region of Jerusalem and the Judean mountains. And so the Jews had a very, very difficult time in their history, politically, socially, economically, and especially religiously. So what Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi did, and we'll speak more about this, God willing, when we get to the 2nd century in our discussions, he took the teachings that would become the Mishnah, but he specifically did not list it as a law code. He did not list all of the conclusions. He rather listed a series of debates. He listed a series when Rabbi X says this and Rabbi Y says that. And like if you're looking to the Mishnah to try to find the answer, how can I cook this chicken? Is it kosher or not? You won't find that answer there. You have to enter into the debate because you see that Rabbi X says it is kosher, Rabbi Y says it isn't kosher. And the only way to know it is to actually engage in the debate, see how that debate eventually ends. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi does not offer that to you because he intentionally retained this open-ended, dialogue necessary document. It's absolutely fascinating. Let me give you a look at a couple of examples. So this is a passage from the Mishnah in Peah. That's a tractate that describes how when you are harvesting your field, you have to leave a corner of the field behind for the poor people. The word Peah means corner. The Peah, which is the corner of the field, the first fruits that you would bring to Jerusalem as a sacrificial offering, the appearance in Jerusalem, like showing up, and the acts of kindness. And finally, the study of Torah. These, on the other hand, are the things which one enjoys the interest thereof in this world, but the principal value is in the next world. And notice here, by the way, the rabbis make an explicit reference to Olam Haba, the world to come, heaven, as it were, which is not something you find in the Bible in the same way. Kibud Ava'im, honoring father and mother, right? You enjoy kind of like an ancillary benefit of that particular commandment in this world, but the principal value, the reward of it, is in the next world. Gumul Chasodim, and kindness to others. Bahava Shalom Ben Adam and bringing about peace between people. The Talmud Torah, and learning Torah. Well, that's the best of everything. Okay, very nice. So that's the Mishnah. It's kind of an open-ended statement in terms of you want to know what more about these things, but there's no internal contradiction until you get to the very next passage, which says, "Ein pochasin lapea mishvishin." You can't leave less than 1 part in 60 as the sacrificial offering of peah. What? You just told me that there's no shiur, there's no size to peah. Now in the very next Mishnah, you're saying there's a size. The Mishnah continues, even though I know, I just said that there's no measure to it. It has to do with the greatness of the field, the size of the field, and according to the needs of the poor, and according to how much of yield the field gives. So it just throws out the first Mishnah out the window, and now we're going with the second Mishnah. And we also don't have a clear large size. We have one at 60 that the rabbis give us, but we don't have a larger size. And then if you look in the third part of this Mishnah, which I'm not going to go into, then there's not only size in terms of how much area you have to divide, but when you have to divide it, where in the field you divide it, and so on. And so the Mishnah offers right away different approaches to the same question, and the only way you can really understand what you're supposed to do is by engaging it, and hopefully engaging it with a study partner, and especially engaging it with a master, a rabbi, who will then give you the course of the debate and bring you to a conclusion. That's how the Mishnah works. It is intrinsically dialectical in nature. You must engage it. You must ideally engage it with other human beings as well. What's in the Mishnah? So the 6 orders of the Mishnah form the acronym Zman Nakat, which means takes time, or if you like, time flies. And they are as follows. The first 3, making up the acronym Zman, or time, are seeds, which are primarily dealing with the agricultural law. We saw that in the Mishnah on Peah that we just looked at. That's referring to agricultural laws in Israel. How do you take the Peah from your field? The second section is times, which primarily deals with holidays. The Sabbath, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, things like that. Third section, which is the largest section, is women, Nashim. And this also gives us a sense of how androcentric the document is. It's primarily written by men for men, and so it is about women. And so this section on women deals with how does one marry a woman, how does one divorce a woman, how does one pay the divorce settlement and ketubot, all kinds of things like this that deal primarily with relations with women. Then the fourth section is damages. And yes, there's a lot of yeshiva jokes about the sequence here, but damages are kind of like the classic section of the Mishnah. By the way, all of this forms the core of what would become later the Talmud. So the Talmud is essentially an extensive discussion of the Mishnah. More on that in a later class. And then holy things, which deals primarily with the temple, sacrificial laws, and finally purities, which deal with the complex laws of personal purity, such as with bathing and ritual immersions and so on. So those are the areas that are of concern to the Mishnah, divided into these 6 sections. The 6.